Donald Trump calls his visit to China incredible, and Xi Jinping says it was a landmark meeting. But the Chinese president's comments about Taiwan are raising concerns. Could a dispute over the territory lead to conflict between Beijing and Washington? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. A year ago, U.S.-China relations reached one of their lowest points when Donald Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs. The U.S. president made some concessions when he met Xi Jinping a few months later. And the White House yielded more ground in the run-up to Trump's visit to Beijing. It suspended a $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan, which China claims as its sovereign territory. But that did not stop President Xi from calling Taiwan the single most important issue in relations with the U.S. So, could differences over Taiwan put Washington and Beijing at odds, as signaled by the Chinese leader? Will the U.S. dial down its support for Taiwan? We'll raise these questions with our guests shortly, but first, this report by Imogen Kimber.
Taiwan is the most important issue in U.S.-China relations. That's according to President Xi Jinping during the first state visit by a US president to Beijing in nearly a decade. The Chinese president made the comments during a 2-hour meeting with Donald Trump. Taiwan is a self-governing nation, but it was occupied by China. Beijing says it must rejoin the mainland, and it doesn't rule out using force to make that happen. Besides talk of Taiwan, Xi emphasized the need for unity between Beijing and Washington.
We both agree that the China-US relationship is currently the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. Cooperation benefits both sides, while confrontation harms both. We should be partners, not rivals.
While US President Trump had nothing but praise for Xi.
This has been an incredible visit. I think a lot of good has come of it. We've made some fantastic trade deals, great for both countries. He's a man I respect greatly.
Apple CEO Tim Cook, Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang, and Elon Musk all joined Trump on the trip.
It was marvelous. Thank you so much. It's so great to be back in China.
On his way back to the US, President Trump said policy on Taiwan had not changed. Although, he said he may or may not approve weapons for Taipei, and he's made no commitment.
And on Taiwan, he doesn't want to see a movement for independence. He says, look, we've had it for thousands of years.
The US has long said it will support Taiwan with weapons and ensure it can maintain self-defense. The US has looked to China for support in ending the war with Iran. China purchases up to 90% of Iran's oil, giving it significant influence. Some in Taiwan face uncertainty.
People across the Taiwan Strait need peace. This requires the leaders' wisdom. As for America, it's not going to benefit us all if it keeps on telling people what to do. On one hand, it pressures us to buy weapons, and on the other, it plays a two-pronged strategy with China.
More meetings between the two leaders are reportedly planned. Xi Jinping says he wants to break the cycle of competition between great powers and replace it with unity. Whether that can be done and what it would mean for the rest of the world has the potential to shift the global balance of power beyond their borders. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, to dissect all this further, let's bring in our guests from Washington, D.C., Wyne. He's Senior Research and Advocacy Advisor for U.S.-China Relations at the International Crisis Group. In Changsha, China, Victor Gao. He's the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. And in Taipei, Wen-Ti, a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. A warm welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us today on Inside Story. Wen-Ti, let me start with you today. As we heard in that report, at the start of this summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping made it clear that Taiwan is the most important issue in U.S.-China relations. After the summit, while on his way back to the U.S., President Trump said that the policy on Taiwan has not changed, but he also said he may or may not approve weapons for Taipei and that he's made no commitment. What do the words spoken and the language used by Trump and Xi signal to Taiwanese leadership at this stage?
Wow, it's a lot unpacked right there. I think, of course, what we expect, the kind of rhetoric that came out of President Xi from China, a lot of continuity in substance, some variation in style, but basically the same message we're hearing from Xi is that Taiwan remains the reddest of all red lines for China, and that for them, Taiwan is basically the identity-defining issue, if you will, for U.S.-China relations. That from Chinese perspective, U.S. gets Taiwan right, they are going to be friends, and if alternatively U.S. gets Taiwan wrong, then China may see itself sliding into adversarial territory with the U.S. before you knew it. So that we are not too surprised about it. I think on the U.S. reaction to it, there seems to be, I guess President Trump will be Trump. He's going to be presenting the same kind of unpredictability we expect from him for years, and he's no different this time around. So I think in terms of broader contours, there's no real reason why U.S. want to really change its position on Taiwan at this juncture. Because if you think about Trump, Trump is a businessman by nature, and businessmen try to sell things high at a high price point, and that means they will do it when U.S. feels it's in a good bargaining position vis-a-vis China. But the reality is that U.S. been finding itself once again getting stuck in the Middle Eastern quagmire over Iran, over Strait of Hormuz, and other issues. And so it's not quite in the best position to sell high, if you will, even if they want to sell high, which is already a huge assumption. So I think at this moment, Taiwan is watching all this carefully, of course, but they are doing it with a degree of composure. And if Taiwan's many affairs officials' statement yesterday is any guide, then so far from Taiwan's perspective, they don't see any major surprises coming out of the meetings so far.
Victor, Xi Jinping warned Donald Trump that missteps on Taiwan could push their two countries into conflict. From your vantage point, how significant was that sort of laying down of the law in shaping the tone of the rest of the summit?
Well, whenever we talk about the Taiwan issue, we should keep the Taiwan issue in historical perspective. First of all, Japan occupied it from 1895 to 1945, and the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation dictated that Japan had to surrender Taiwan back to China. And under its unconditional surrender term, Japan did surrender Taiwan to China in 1945. So this has been carved in stone. No one should disagree with this. Secondly, there was a civil war in China, which resulted in the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1945, and the fleeing from mainland China to Taiwan by the nationalist government, the KMT as we used to call it, the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, which was to a very large extent an anti-Japan aggression hero in China. So this is also a fact. Ever since 1949, Taiwan and China existed in kind of separation from each other. The nationalist government wanted to retake mainland China. China claimed to use force to reclaim Taiwan. So the two sides waited until the early 1980s to decide, well, such blatant threat to each other may not be the right thing. They started the process of rapprochement. And over the decades, rapprochement became more and more intensified to such an extent at any given moment, there will be about 2 million people from Taiwan living, working, traveling, studying, marrying in mainland China. And there have been 500,000 what we call mainland brides married into Taiwanese families. So the two sides got closer and closer together. If there were no foreign intervention, if there was no kind of incentive given to the so-called separatists in Taiwan, the two sides may have already joined hands together. Now, you talked about the United States. Allow me to mention one thing. The United States recognized the Republic of China all the way till Dr. Henry Kissinger made that famous secret visit to China in 1971. Then President Nixon made the first state visit ever by a sitting U.S. president to China. And then it took Ford and then up to the next president to really establish diplomatic relations between China and mainland China and the United States. Now, China raised the three preconditions before normalization could be achieved between China and the United States. One, to withdraw all the U.S. troops from Taiwan. Very important. Secondly, to cancel U.S. recognition of the Republic of China. in Taiwan. Third, which was almost a mission impossible, to terminate the US-Taiwan Defense Treaty. Now, the United States were forced to satisfy each and all of these three preconditions before China and the United States normalized the diplomatic relations in 1979. So this is all the very important historical background. If anyone in Taiwan, they are a separate, independent country, separate from China, they are indulging in fantasy. They will never be allowed to become an independent and sovereign country. And even if you assume the United States give the maximum support, Taiwan will still remain part of China. When President Trump says there will be no change in U.S. policy regarding Taiwan, I'm so happy
Victor,
he said that.
I'm sorry to
There
interrupt.
should be
I need to get a question over to Ali. Let me get back to you about the point you're making in just a minute. But Ali, let me ask you from your perspective, did the U.S. expect China to be so overt in these statements when it comes to Taiwan?
I think so. China has telegraphed, even before the meeting between President Trump and President Xi, if you look at the conversation that had taken place prior between the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and his counterpart, Wang Yi, Wang Yi had conveyed in similarly stark language that the brightest of red lines for China would be Taiwanese independence. I think I would make a distinction in terms of what transpired at the summit. I would make a distinction between official sort of declaratory U.S. policy and sort of informal policy. I think that the United States had telegraphed in advance of this meeting that there wouldn't be any change in official policy, and indeed there hasn't been any official change in official U.S. cross-strait policy. I think that if I were President Xi, my strategy vis-a-vis President Trump would be to capitalize on President Trump's seeming disinterest in Taiwan security. President Trump views Taiwan, or at least has viewed Taiwan mainly to date, through the lens of its chip-making capacity. President Trump has said that Taiwan doesn't spend enough on defense. It has stolen America's semiconductor industry. He has deputized his Commerce Secretary to try and onshore 40% of Taiwan's semiconductor production capacity to the United States by the end of Trump's second terms. So I think that President Xi will try to capitalize on President Trump's seeming disinterest in Taiwan security. And I think that he will also try to encourage President Trump to normalize, to regularize actions that the president himself has already taken. To give a couple of examples, President Trump has said, breaking with decades of U.S. president, he has said that now he and President Xi will negotiate future U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. I think the President Xi will encourage him to continue that. President Trump, at a sensitive juncture in the U.S.-China relationship last year, prevented a stopover across the United States by the Taiwanese president, William Lai. I think the President Xi will encourage him to continue with that precedent. So even if the United States, I think if I were in Taiwan, my concern would be less about changes in declaratory official U.S. policy and more about informal, accumulated steps that President Trump might take that privilege, I think, Beijing's sensitivities over Taipei's concerns.
Wen-Ti, I saw you reacting to some of what Ali was saying there, so I'm going to give you a chance to jump in.
Yeah, for sure. This meeting, I think many expected beforehand to be primarily a business meeting where two sides cut deal a little more than a geopolitical the watershed moment where major, huge changes, watershed changes to declaratory policy will be made. So I think on that, I definitely find a lot to agree with Ali just now. And definitely that's one potential concern for many here, which is the stuff that happened under the table. Like, it doesn't need to be overt shift to official U.S. policy when it comes to how U.S. position its relationship with Taiwan or how it sees Taiwan in its future, but rather it can be something more subtle, e.g. maybe some downgrade in diplomatic signaling, for example, in terms of U.S. support for Taiwan, maybe slowing down or delays of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, as well as perhaps some shifts or downgrades in protocol in terms of kind of official or semi-official or de facto official relationship between exchanges between U.S. and Taiwan. I think these are matters that Taiwan side are trying to monitor a lot. And of course, many in Taiwan find solace in the fact that U.S. State Secretary Marco Rubio has a long-standing trajectory as a track record, as a friend of Taiwan who happened to be right now playing a huge position in the administration when it comes to foreign security policy, including on Taiwan. However, the concern is that Marco Rubio may not be the only person who has President Trump's ears. And if you're judging by the composition of President Trump's delegation this time around, with a huge number of business tycoons, Elon Musk, for example, and many others, does seem to be taking up disproportionate amount of the airtime and maybe eartime or face time with President Trump. So that's something that Taiwan is still trying to work out, how to go to the ears rather of President Trump, and to make sure that Taiwan remains visible and remains on the forefront of Washington's thinking about position in the Indo-Pacific.
Ali, let me ask you a little bit about the optics that emerged from this visit from Trump to China. The fact that Xi, offered up such tough talk in front of Trump, and that Trump didn't express displeasure, what does that say to you about the nature of the U.S.-Chinese relationship right now? I mean, Trump is not known as someone who typically holds his tongue when he's confronted by behavior that he might usually consider to be an affront, right?
I think that your question gets to, at least to my way of thinking, one of the most important takeaways from the summit, maybe even the most important takeaway from the summit, which is President Trump now is dealing with a far more capable and confident China than the one that he saw when he made his first official state visit to China a little over, or close to a decade ago, in November of 2017. In November of 2017, I think that many observers would call China a rapidly resurgent emerging power, but few observers, if any, would classify China as being a near peer to the United States. The Chinese delegation in November 2017 expended a lot of diplomatic capital trying to persuade President Trump that President Xi was his geopolitical equal. What is striking this time around is that the Chinese delegation didn't have to make any such case, because it was the president himself who acknowledged China's newfound centrality within the international system. He invoked this construct, the G2. The G2 is essentially this idea that the United States and China, as the world's two most powerful countries, that they should, even if informally, but that they should regularly and intentionally coordinate to uphold international order. The G2 is a construct that President Trump's predecessors had all swatted down because they didn't want to convey the impression that China was a near peer. So I think that if you're President Xi, the most significant win, albeit an intangible one, the most significant win for President Xi is that for the first time, it is an American commander-in-chief of his own volition, unprompted, who has acknowledged that China has arrived as a near peer, and thereby according China recognition that it has long desired.
Victor, what do you think will be the most important outcome of this state visit? What would China be taking away as a win or a success from this visit?
Well, out of 10, I will give 9.99 to the success of this victory of the presidential state visit to China. Why? Several things. First of all, you may recall President Biden never paid a state visit to China during his 4 years of presidency, and this broke the tradition between China and the United States, because ever since President Reagan, each of the sitting presidents of the United States will make a state visit to China. So Biden broke off that tradition and record. Now President Trump, through this state visit, reconnected China and the United States through very important state visits. And the fact that he invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to visit the United States later this year shows the continuity of the very top level connections with each other. Now, so long as China and the United States can talk, especially at the very top level, the world should feel better and more at ease. Secondly, President Trump did demonstrate his eagerness to be the chief salesperson of the United States to China. He wants to peddle as many products to China as possible. He brought about 17 major tycoons. Combined value of their stocks probably would account for more than 50% of the total market capitalization in the United States. So you are talking about very sizable, very significant companies. And I understand many of them are still staying in China, engaged in company-to-company discussions with the Chinese counterparts. They want to invest more in China. They want to buy more from China. They want to sell more to China. This speaks loudly to the complete failure of the disconnect between China and the United States, the de-risking strategy, for example. All these things failed miserably. So I think the state visit by President Trump really ushered into China-U.S. relations a new era.
Victor,
where
let me follow up with something let me ask you about something you're talking about, because Donald Trump said that he'd struck fantastic trade deals while in China that were great for both countries, but not a lot of details have emerged yet. Are we hearing any more from Chinese officials on that?
Well, in China, I can tell you the real truth. The demand for U.S.-made goods and commodities is huge, and China can easily be the most important market for anything made and produced and manufactured in the United States. So this is the very good news. The key is how to leverage off all the huge size and market potential in China. And allow me to emphasize, trade needs to be reciprocal. You cannot just expect to sell a maximum amount to China while blocking Chinese export to the United States. That means the two countries need to respect each other and engage with each other for the common good, rather than maximizing pressure on China, blocking Chinese export on the one hand, and expecting that they can sell massively into the Chinese market. I truly believe President Trump learned the lesson, and he does not want to put maximum pressure on China, because China will retaliate. For quite a few months, China refused to buy any Boeing plane, China refused to take delivery of any soybean products, and China refused to take up any of the LNG products from the United States. Who suffered more? Both China and the United States suffered. I would say the United States suffered more than China. So rationality and sanity need to be restored for China and the United States to deal with each other as equal and respecting each other, helping each other whenever it is necessary, so that the Americans can benefit from engaging with the largest market in the world.
Ali, let me ask you about this. You heard Victor there talk about the fact that Donald Trump arrived to this summit accompanied by several CEOs. This was a high-level business delegation that went along with Trump to China. Trump's been talking about fantastic deals having been made. Do you think that this visit went the way that the U.S. hoped it would when it came to business deals?
Well, we'll certainly find out a lot more. And as you said, I think that there are a lot of details that we still don't know, that details that I think will come to light in the coming days and weeks. But I think that I would say it sends a significant signal about the sort of direction of travel about the Trump administration's China policy, which is still emerging, and we still have more than 2 years left in the second Trump administration. So his China policy will likely continue to evolve. I would say, though, that it represents, I think, a pretty sharp departure from the orientation of China policy of both the first Trump administration and also the Biden administration. In both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, there was an emphasis on de-risking. And the argument that both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration had made was that the U.S. private sector for too long had undermined America's national security by privileging its bottom line over the national interests of the United States. I think that what the second Trump administration is doing is not only backing away from de-risking, but actually saying we want U.S. companies, these major U.S. technology companies, to gain a greater exposure to China, to gain a greater foothold in China. So I think that we're seeing a kind of reversal in the orientation of China policy. And I would just make one point, not only about President Trump's focus on the business aspects of the U.S.-China relationship, but a broader point about his worldview. President Trump is something of an iconoclast in Washington when it comes to China policy. And I think that there are two views of his that make him especially different, maybe even unique, singular in Washington. The first, he seems to have a genuine affinity for President Xi. You saw the praise that he used, the really quite effusive praise that he used to describe his Chinese counterpart when the two leaders met in Beijing. And in that regard, he's quite iconoclastic. The second way in which he's quite different from, I would say, virtually any other policy official in Washington is most others in Washington take a quite expansive view of strategic competition. I think that the president, by contrast, takes a rather narrow view. He has two long-standing grievances against China. One, the size of China's trade surplus. Two, China's export of fentanyl precursors. But outside of those two grievances, a lot of the other long-standing irritants in the U.S.-China relationship don't particularly animate him. So I would just to summarize, I would say, one, I think that the president is moving away from de-risking. He wants U.S. technology companies to expose themselves more, embed themselves more in China's market. And he also has, I think, a very iconoclastic view of China policy.
Wen-Ti, I want to ask you if there is an anxiety or a fear in Taiwan that the U.S. could, over time, soften its position on Taiwan in order to perhaps get more support from China, whether that's in relation to resolving issues with Iran or whether it's resolving issues when it comes to trade disputes. What is the level of concern in Taiwan when it comes to that?
I think there's mixed feelings in Taiwan. There's, to some extent, a confidence that relations between U.S. and Taiwan has been so long-standing that it's that he has bipartisan support in the U.S., especially on Capitol Hill, that it's very hard to imagine any kind of a practical, quote-unquote, abandonment of Taiwan by the U.S. I mean, at this point, it's pretty hard to imagine how that would even look like in practical policy terms. So there's confidence in that. There are, however, of course, as always, worries that in this U.S.-China-Taiwan trilateral relationship, obviously you have two huge superpowers alongside Taiwan itself. And at the meeting, like this Trump-Xi meeting recently, for example, this week, there is the sense, to quote one Taiwanese official, there is a sense that when Taiwan is not at the table, there's always an inherent potential risk of Taiwan feeling like it just might be on the menu. So that fear, that anxiety coexist just because of the sheer differential in size. Into the more longer term, though, if you look forward, I think Taiwan still finds that relationship between two sides, between U.S. and Taiwan, at the people-to-people level, at the cultural level, at the shared similar liberal democratic value level, these things, in addition to technological and economic complementarity of interest, are what's going to sustain their interest and their cohesion as friends and partners for the longer haul. So not without concern, but there's confidence overall for the long term.
All right, well, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Ali Wyne, Victor Gao, and Wen-Ti Song. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment. Stay tuned.